I know it's been some time, but I just completed the remaster of Tomb Raider 3, and here are my thoughts and feelings. Before I say anything, I'd like to mention that this is a game I wasn't overly familiar with before this playthrough. I've played parts of it before, but never completed it without breaking the rules. This is a really tough game, and I could never complete it for the longest time, but the release of Tomb Raider 1 through 3 Remastered felt like the time to change that. So, how does this game hold up in 2024 against its predecessors? Well, let's talk about it. I won't go over the story in this video as I feel it suffers from mediocrity. While it has some strong points, I felt it to be too similar to the previous games and was a little too predictable at times. But as I've said before, this is simply a minor issue in the grand scheme of things as I personally don't play any video game just for the storyline. Upon rewatching my past videos, I've noticed that I've been overly negative when I didn't necessarily need or want to be. I'll try and change that this time around. Onto the game itself, you may have noticed I've neglected to discuss the Lara's home tutorial stages from any of the previous TR games, and that's because I've been saving it for this video. Each game in the original trilogy had its own respective tutorial stage, taking place in Lara's house. In Tomb Raider 1 we got a linear set of obstacles to pass through in sequence, which was great for learning about the game, but I felt the best part about it was the world building. The setting and other thematic elements was something that defined Lara's character, and when you pair that with some narration, you get a great tutorial level.
Right, this is a really big one. So do a running jump exactly as before, except while I'm in the air, press and hold the action button to make me grab the ledge. Nice.
With the second game, the tutorial stage was non-linear, with many areas to explore and things to do. This had the edge over the first game in my opinion, with the exploration-based design being a great translation of how these games' level structures are created. Tomb Raider 3 has the best tutorial stage I've ever played. I won't spoil everything, but long story short, there's a treasure room, swimming fish tank, shooting range, secret attic accessed by a hidden switch and a massive racetrack, while including the non-linear design from TR2 and the obstacle course from the first game. This is the textbook definition of a perfect tutorial level in my eyes. But moving forward with the main event, TR3 uses the same chapter and stage structure from previous games, albeit with a few differences, which I'll address as I come to them. Lara begins in India on the hunt for the Infada Stone, one of the many artifacts to be found throughout the game. This first stage is just alright. It's really just more of what's been seen from past opening levels, just with a more sprawling layout and some new traps. It's quite long for being the first stage, and my favourite part of it has to be the beginning area. Upon reaching the end of the first section, there's a massive spike in challenge. Temple Ruins, the second stage, is a prime example of confusing level design. I don't find this one to be enjoyable, and it's easy to get lost. It starts outside and you're immediately attacked by poisonous snakes. There are loads of them in this area as well. If Lara gets poisoned, her life will deplete until a medipack is used. Thankfully they aren't as hard to find as in the second game, but if you don't have any, you'll die unless you reach the end of the stage. Not much advice to give for this mechanic, but if there's one thing you mustn't do, it's save the game while being poisoned. It's pretty obvious why, but you can save your game at your will on this remastered version of the game, but it's important to take note of nonetheless. This outdoor section is pretty fun, just a lot of platforming, but it highlights another issue I have with this game. In TR1 and 2 when you pulled a switch, used an item or stood on a pressure pad, it would show you what that action did. This provided some direction of where to go, but sadly in Tomb Raider 3, most activatable objects don't do this. It's really frustrating, and it made this stage infinitely more challenging because I kept getting stuck. Once you get inside the temple, this level starts to go downhill. For being the second stage of the game, it's big and every room looks the same. Essentially you need to find 5 keys, but it's too easy to get disoriented. When poison darts, invisible platforms and boring block pushing puzzles are added, you get an unfavourable Tomb Raider level in my opinion. In TR2 there weren't really any levels where I got lost or stuck for more than a few minutes. In the first game, Palace Midas, the Cistern and Natla's Mines left me scratching my head occasionally, but the third game goes too far. After leaving the temple, Lara finds a quad bike and has to chase someone down a piranha-inhabited river. This is a great stage, and thankfully driving the quad bike isn't as monotonous as the snowmobile. You're presented with 2 different paths. The left path focuses more on driving, and the right tasks you with finding some keys on foot. I can't stress enough how much I love this idea, and it shows up again in later stages. The multiple path concept is sometimes also combined with story narrative, and that makes for some really immersive levels. In this case, I chose the left path. You can miss secrets depending on which route you take in some instances, but unlike my playthroughs of TR1 and 2, I didn't get them all anyways. Finding all 60 in this game rewards you with a bonus stage, but I've heard it's nothing special, therefore I doubt I'm missing out on much. Next we reach the Caves of Kalia, my favourite level of this chapter. I've critiqued mazes before, but the one in this stage is great. There's even this dark cobra pit you fall into, and it's such a great moment. There's also a boss battle with the guy from the cutscenes earlier, but he goes down pretty easy. I have mixed feelings about the first part of this game. The first level is mediocre and I don't have much to say about it. The second one I found to be way too complicated for its own good, but I think the other stages are great stuff. After a CGI cutscene which explains some plot points about the rest of the game, which I won't discuss, you get to choose what chapter you play next. You're split between the South Pacific, London and Nevada, and in this playthrough, I chose Nevada for a reason I will explain in a moment. The first part of this section tasks Lara with venturing into the deserts to invade a military base where one of the artifacts is being kept. This stage is among my favourites in the series, too bad it has more poisonous snakes however. After leaving the starting area, you get to a long climbing section around a canyon, fall down at any point and it's back to the start, although thankfully you have unlimited saves. There's this reservoir area which acts as a large puzzle, eventually allowing access to a detonator key which can be used to advance forward later on. This leads to a section with some electric fences and another quad bike. Oddly enough, one of the buttons you need to press will simply kill you if you try and use it. Driving the quad bike allows Lara to jump over a fence and complete the stage. Following on from this is another no weapons level set in a prison. Both the previous two games had similar parts like this, but the difference here is that you don't get your items back. This is the reason why playing the Nevada section first is a smart idea, because you will lose every item you collected up to this point, and considering how hard this game is, it's much better to lose them now instead of later. What I will say is that this is unequivocally the best no weapons stage in the trilogy, having elements of stealth and a presence of enemies, but it doesn't feel unfair like the oil rig chapter of Tomb Raider 2, and it's not as dull as Natla's Mines from the first game. This is, again, another great stage, although I wish it had less cheap traps, a recurring theme with this game. Upon starting the last part of this chapter, I noticed something, and that was that all of the items that were in Lara's inventory had reappeared somehow. And upon rewatching the footage I captured, this was intentional. Turns out the remastered version of this game gives you back all of your guns, ammo and medkits, so I suppose there is more of a reason to have freedom within which way you, the player, progress through the story, but I'll discuss this further at the end of the video. The Nevada section ends with another poorly signposted electrical hazard and an alien spaceship, which holds the next artifact Lara needs to collect. It looks quite small and insignificant from the outside, but the interior is much bigger, done by some strange illusion technique. This sort of thing shows up again in the second stage of the London section, and I really like what they tried to do here. Other highlights of this stage include launching a missile, avoiding a laser trap while swinging on some bars, and a water tank with some orcas in it. Overall, I thought this was again another enjoyable section. Like with before, you can again choose which chapter you want to play next, but I chose to do London for a change of scenery. Just like its real life counterpart, London is dark, depressing and difficult to navigate. This first stage is just awful. It starts you off in this massive area with many branching paths, and the level designer clearly have a complete disregard for any sense of direction or guidance. There are quite a few objectives to do in this area, including keys to find, buttons to press, and switches to pull. If you don't do things in the right order or know where to go in the first place, it's a miserable experience from start to finish. After running around aimlessly for a few minutes and doing some tricky jumps, the level just ended abruptly. For how many unexplored areas remain in this level, something didn't feel right. Turns out I was correct. After looking up a walkthrough online, I found that this was an unintentional bug shortcut, which is crazy on its own, but the fact that the stage was so complicated that I found an illegal shortcut skipping 90% of it before the intended route is quite concerning to say the least. After finding this out, I went back and completed the stage the normal way, but I can't say I missed much. There is even another ridiculously annoying alarm sound that made me mute my TV. When you add all of the tedium together, this is one of my least favourite individual stages of the series. Aldwych Station marks the second part of the London section, and this might be the hardest Tomb Raider level I've ever legitimately completed. Again, I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed this, although it wasn't nearly as boring as the previous stage. Instead of verbally describing what you're meant to do in this level, and then explaining how long and complicated it is, I'll just show you the length of the walkthrough I found online, as it basically does the same thing. As a whole, this level is just confusing, monotonous, and frustrating, but really there are two specific parts that annoy me the most, which I'll briefly run over. Firstly, apparently breaking into buildings, murdering police officers, guards, and dogs is perfectly acceptable, but climbing over a London Underground ticket barrier, that has to be at least a 10-year sentence. To advance forward, Lara needs to use a coin to buy a ticket. The coin itself is easy enough to come by, but locating where to use it is ridiculously cryptic. In the majority of circumstances where a given item needs to be placed, it's clearly signposted, such as a keyhole or other receptacle. When it's not, there is always some other form of visual direction, such as the scimitar statues in the second stage. Here, there's absolutely none of that, with the only subtle hint being some ticket booths near the start of the map. So, you go up to the ticket booth and find out it doesn't work, and at this point the game is just giving you the middle finger. Why? Because you weren't supposed to use it on that booth, but this specific one here, meaning it's trial and error until you get the right one. There's no difference between all of the textures on the one that works and the others that don't, which is completely stupid. I guarantee the highest percentile of players will simply approach one of the ticket booths, find out it doesn't work, and continue to look elsewhere. Nobody's going to try and just use the other ones because they all look the same. At this rate, it's a better option for Lara to just be able to climb over the turnstiles to avoid the pain and suffering. The other part I loathe about this stage is this maze. Mazes are already a pretty shallow way of extending playtime, but this maze is something else entirely. It's full of numerous buttons that open and close doors around the maze, meaning certain buttons need to be pressed in a given order and other ones need to be left alone. As you can guess, it's just not fun, and it comes down to trial and error again because there's no clues whatsoever, objectively bad game design. If I had to name one specific part of the original trilogy that annoys me the most, this maze would come out on top. It's pure torture, and I would honestly just recommend looking up a tutorial. After running around the station aimlessly for another hour, I finally completed the map. Doing it without any guidance is something truly commendable, but not enjoyable, at least to me. The final stage of the London section is the near universally hated Lud's Gate, which tasks Lara with sneaking into the Natural History Museum to steal some items for a fellow acquaintance before descending to the sewers below. I'll start off by saying that this is the level that the developers improved the most on when it comes to the remastered collection. I'll explain why soon enough. After completing a fun puzzle in this Egyptian-themed room and climbing up a tower, you're presented with two different paths, and out of all of the stages that do this, I think this one does it the best. In this case, I chose to take the longer path, which was great. Aside from some of the rooms you venture through being nicely decorated and fun to traverse, I love the narrative this stage tells. You arrive back at the start of the level and open a door which leads to the second part of the stage, and this is where the two paths merge again. Next comes a water-heavy area which has several different paths, including a room which we came by earlier. I like the way some of these stages loop back on themselves, as it adds an extra level of immersion to these games that I love. Traversing the underwater sections can be challenging, but if you took the longer path earlier, Lara is given a submersible which can move fast and shoot harpoons. Eventually, you will come across a dark underwater complex with 16 different openings, each with switches and doors behind. On the PS1 original, it was so dark in here that you couldn't see anything. Couple that with limited saves and you're left with one of the most frustrating and tedious parts of the series. On the remastered version, you can see fine and save the game at your will. A tip to get through here pain-free is to use the free cam in the photo mode to look down each of the tunnels so you can deduce where to go. This makes the area a lot more feasible to traverse. Aside from drowning, your only other risk is from harpoon shooting scuba divers and alligators, and these are what make this section a slog for me. The submersible is difficult to aim at enemies, so it's better to just dismount it temporarily and use the harpoon gun instead. Honestly, this section is really not that bad anymore. With the photo mode, unlimited saves, and properly programmed gamma, the only thing you need to worry about are the enemies. The level ends shortly after this part, and I did not expect this, but I think it's one of the best levels of this game. I like the narrative it tells, as well as the multiple paths. Making progress also feels rewarding. It's just a shame that alligators and divers took some of the fun out of it. After another creative boss fight, I finished the London section, which I have mixed feelings about overall. The third stage is a personal highlight, but the switch maze, ticket gate, and laborious beginning section let it down significantly. With one more chapter required to finish the endgame, I moved on to the South Pacific Islands. Here, Lara needs to find the fourth and final artifact in this tropical setting. It begins with another stage with multiple pathways, although I ended up not knowing this until after completing it. This level is another great example of confusing level layouts. It starts simple enough, but when you get to the point where the two routes merge, it gets tiresome and frustrating to navigate. It's also filled with genuinely unfair traps with no visual signposting. Reminds me of the Atlantis section of Tomb Raider 1. I went into this part thinking I would enjoy it, but I was honestly kind of glad when it finished. At the beginning of the next area, Lara needs to traverse across some quicksand, and if you've ever wanted to know the textbook definition of trial and error, look no further. The map is almost useless. Because of how the grid-based geometry system doesn't line up with the markings on it, it means this part just becomes a laborious task. After a few minutes of frustration, I ended up just ignoring the map and started jumping in random directions hoping I wouldn't sink and suffocate. Every time I landed on the right part, saving the game meant I could respawn where I left off. And by the way, I'd like to thank the developers for changing the save system, as in the original version you were limited on how many times you could do this. Out of the different save systems used by the PS1 TR games, I thought Tomb Raider 2 had the best interpretation of it, which thankfully has now been implemented into all of the titles in the remaster. You also have plenty of free files, which means getting a save of every level is much less arduous than it was in The Last Revelation and Tomb Raider Chronicles. But back to the quicksand, it took me the best part of 20 minutes, and is a perfect demonstration of this game's flaws, at least in my opinion. On a positive note, the rest of this chapter was among the best TR3 has to offer. You get to explore a military plane crash site, blow up velociraptors with rockets, use a kayak to descend some rapids, and even get to fight another T-Rex, similar to the Lost Valley at the beginning of Tomb Raider 1. As for the kayaking section, I honestly believe this is one of the best stages of the game. You start off by going downstream through some dangerous waters before reaching an underground lake with a giant plug in it. Lara must then platform and climb back through previously explored areas to find a switch to drain the water. After the entrance to the final area is revealed, you can drop down and finish the stage, which in my opinion is the second best of this game. But there is one more stage which I thought was even better. I'll talk about this in a moment. All that's left to do to finish the South Pacific chapter is to get through another trap marathon and defeat another boss. This stage in particular, while short, was one of the ones that had me getting the most frustrated. Mainly it was this room, where you need to press 4 buttons while avoiding these rolling blades. Finding out which areas are safe to stand is challenging, and I died in this part more times than I'd like to admit. A dramatic boulder chase sequence ends up looping back around to the starting area, but this time another door is opened, allowing Lara to progress further. Here there is another boss encounter, which I found to be very challenging, even though I mostly killed myself by accidentally jumping off this platform. Although, an unpopular opinion of mine might be that I think the game's strongest element is actually the combat. The weapon selection is the best it's ever been, with new additions such as a rocket launcher and Desert Eagle. I like how each weapon is intended to be used in different situations. For example, the new MP5 rifle can hit foes from a great distance, but Lara's mobility is limited while using it. Therefore it's recommended to be used at range, and not in close proximity with an enemy. Comparing this with the first game, where not only was the arsenal much smaller, but the situational aspect of combat was arguably almost non-existent. Another issue I had with Tomb Raider 1's combat was the poor enemy placement, which I mainly found to be a problem during the Egypt chapter, where enemies that were more agile and fast than Lara would often be placed in cramped areas such as winding corridors or small platforms. I didn't find any issues with enemy placement in Tomb Raider 3. About 70% of the combat encounters in the second game were with enemies with guns, which were cheap and often forced Lara to get shot, such as in the Venice section, where you were defenseless while driving the motorboat. Compare this with Tomb Raider 3, which still has human enemies. There is a lot more variety this time, with them not being the main focus of attention. You're also not constantly running out of medkits as you were in Tomb Raider 2. Despite what I just said, I also love the emphasis on resource management and conservation, making Tomb Raider 3's combat the best in the classic series in my opinion. Eventually, however, I finished off the boss fight, collected the final artifact, and moved on to the endgame. The final 4 stages are all set in Antarctica, which is the hardest chapter in the trilogy up to this point. I personally found the first of these levels to be another one of the worst ones out of this game. There's a lot of issues with it, mainly just a compiling of shortcomings I've already talked about in previous unfavourable levels, but mainly it was the confusing layout that put me off this one. Navigation is a pain, it's easy to get lost, and the different objectives are always a trek away from each other. I declare this the most boring stage in the entire remastered trilogy. I don't want to go over everything I distaste about this level, as that would take forever, but I wouldn't want to return to it anytime soon, that's for sure. After another cutscene which acts as the most predictable plot twist in the history of literature, Lara descends down into some Arctic mines after having the artifact stole from her. In contrast to the previous section, this part is my favourite stage of the game. Essentially, it's a room with 3 different minecart tracks, each leading to a different area, meaning getting lost is a rare occurrence due to the minecarts always looping back to the main room. A word of advice to anyone who wants to complete this level: don't save the game while riding in the minecarts, as there are several junctions in the tracks that need to be altered or left alone, respectively. There's always only one right way to go, so the wrong path always leads to a solid wall, and just because you can survive getting shot 30 times by a security guard doesn't mean you can live through a minecart crash at 2 miles an hour. If you save the game by going the wrong way, you have no choice but to restart the stage, so be cautious. This stage is much bigger and longer than the previous one, but the tightly designed layout, memorable set pieces, and looping back on yourself leads to a well-paced and highly enjoyable time. Without question, this part is some of the best this collection has to offer, and although it's near the end of the game, it still remains fun and making progress feels rewarding as always. This is the point where I reached the last main stage of the game, Lost City of Tinos, and this was another frustrating level. It's a very long stage, and while not among the worst parts of TR3, I can say I didn't enjoy this much at all. It's the first instance in the series where enemies can spawn infinitely, as these giant wasps are present in what feels like every area. I lost count of how many I killed, but they just didn't stop coming, and sometimes I had to stop exploring so I could shoot an endless stream of bullets until they left me alone for a few minutes. The main goal is to complete 4 different trial rooms, which test your skills in many different areas. One has Lara swim through a punishing underwater complex, in another you have to use trial and error to cross some burning pillars, one room requires traversing through a boring and tedious maze, and finally you have to trek through some mud while avoiding falling bits of rock and even more giant wasps. After completing all of the trials, you can fight the final boss, this weird mutated spider thing, and now all that's left to do is to climb out of the cavern and reach an escape helicopter. Doing so triggers the final cutscene, ending the game. Here are my final statistics. I know it says I finished in close to 15 hours, but it was more like 20, as the in-game clock only counts the time in between saves. Unlike my recent playthroughs of the first 2 games, I didn't find every secret. I might go back and get them in the future, but I thought this game was already hard enough without the extra challenge. And that concluded my first legitimate playthrough of Tomb Raider 3, a game that I honestly thought I would enjoy a lot more than I actually did. As someone who has played the first 2 games several times over, I never previously gave this game too much thought because every time I attempted to do so, I simply couldn't due to the difficulty. And even after completing it without breaking the rules, I still think that's true. It's one of the most challenging games I've ever completed, and it's one of the reasons this video took so long to make. To summarise, I will discuss the main aspects I did like about this game. Firstly, the combat. It's a significant improvement over the first 2 Tomb Raiders, and the majority of encounters were highly enjoyable. The enemy variety is great, the weapon selection has more depth, and I love the emphasis on being more methodical and conservative with how much you use your items. It's always a great time, aside from the underwater tunnels of Lud's Gate. I also thought the addition of choice when it comes to the way events play out was a welcomed addition, making every playthrough feel unique and different from the last. I like how there's now no particular advised method of which chapters to pick first due to fixing the prison level in the Nevada section, which leads me on to my final point. Out of all the entries in the Remastered collection, I saw the most notable improvements with this game. There are countless changes made here which make this the definitive way to play this game, such as the removal of the punishing save system, but to use the example of again, the water part of Lud's Gate, it shows how many areas which were brutal and unforgiving in a bad way in the original version have been made a lot more bearable and in some cases even enjoyable. But despite all of this, there were more things in this game that I actively disliked than that I had a good time with. My biggest problem with Tomb Raider 3 is the pacing. In the first two games, I felt there was a near perfect execution in variety between linear and non-linear structured stages, helping to keep a consistent flow of gameplay and not leave the player feeling like they aren't making any progress. This doesn't mean I dislike non-linearity in level design. In fact, I think it's something that defines Tomb Raider as a whole, and after playing later games like Legend, I noticed a lack of any explorative sections whatsoever, which brought about its own issues. The issue with this game is that there are no linear or straightforward levels at all, and it meant the experience turned out to be a bit of a slog to get through at times, to be honest. By the time I reached the third or fourth section of this game, I was already getting burnt out because of it, and when confusing level design is left, right and centre, you are left with a poorly paced game. Throw in the most complicated parts such as the Aldwych Station section of London, and I eventually felt like I was just forcing myself to complete the game. It felt like a relief when it was over. There are other problems I have with this game that I've already mentioned earlier, but I want to keep the pessimism at a limit for now. As for what I said at the beginning of the video about being overly negative, you could say I failed on that promise, but in my honest opinion, this isn't a great game. So I've now completed and documented the main parts of Tomb Raider 1 through 3 Remastered, but there's still a lot more I would like to talk about with this collection. I'm now going to move on to completing the PC exclusive expansion packs for these games, as they contain content I've never played before, and create 3 more videos on the respective titles. I will say that it definitely won't be 4 months until the next upload, as I hope these next parts won't be as tedious and punishing as Tomb Raider 3 was, at least for me.